This podcast is part of the Listening to Canberra Voices series made at the University of Canberra by the Faculty of Arts and Design 2022. Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm Grace Dudley. Thank you for joining us today. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are recording today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening. Now we are talking to Casey O'Neill, a First Nations student at the University of Canberra. We're going to be discussing identity and the importance of sacred sites to First Nation peoples. So Casey O'Neill, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
That's good. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I just recently turned 25, so I'm a Virgo. I'm the second eldest of 6 kids. I'm a Larrakia woman, lucky enough to have grown up on my traditional land. I'm here in Canberra studying a Bachelor of Arts in creative writing, as I'm wanting to become a writer, writing books and stories and scripts as well. It's what I'm aspiring to be.
So being a Larrakia woman, whereabouts did you grow up and what was it like?
Well, so I was actually born here in Canberra, Ngunnawal country, but unfortunately when I was about 8, my mum passed away and my dad, my siblings and myself all moved to Darwin, which is where my dad was born. Darwin is actually my traditional land. It's considered Larrakia country. It runs from Cox Peninsula in the west out to Gun Point in the north area, down to Adelaide River in the east and to the Manton Dam area in the south region. And I remember that being said in all of my welcome to countries in school. Darwin is the polar opposite of Canberra. It's hot virtually all year round. The sunsets, though, are arguably the best, though I'm a little biased. It's quite small, which makes it much easier to have a tighter-knit community. As it's my traditional land, I have a lot of extended family there, lots of aunties, uncles, cousins. After losing my mum, it was nice being so close to my extended family. My favourite area, though, was, and still is, Nightcliff Foreshore, one of the more popular beaches in Darwin. It's quite small, which makes it much easier to have a tighter knit community. I went there almost once every couple of weeks. I found the water to be very calming and meditative, which makes sense seeing as we Larrakia people are saltwater people.
Nice. That was a really nice introduction.
Thank
you. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about your relationship with the land and how that impacts your cultural identity.
Right. Well, from my own understanding as an Aboriginal woman, the land and country is an integral part of our laws and our ways of life and ways of knowing. We see the land not just as something we walk or live on, we see it as a part of ourselves and it a part of us. We don't see ourselves as above the land, we're more of the land. We're all connected to all things. Our law and spirituality is really intertwined with the land. Our people, you can't really separate one from the other. That's why we see land and country as an incredibly sacred thing.
What does sacred mean to you and what is a sacred site exactly?
Much like what I said before, our land and country are really sacred to us and it being as a part of who we are. They're usually places within the land or country that have a significant or certain special meaning specific to our traditions or the custodians of that land. Once they've been identified as sacred, most of the time they're protected under heritage laws and they're listed as heritage sites. It's usually anything that's a part of the natural landscape. It could be hills, lakes, rocks, trees. You'll find a lot of rock art formations will have a sacred meaning and significance. Like there's a place in Kakadu Park, Ubia Rock, an area of the Kakadu National Park. I visited with my family once, took lots of videos and photos. It was really nice.
What's one of your favourite sacred places to visit?
So to me, personally, like I mentioned earlier, like my favourite place to go in Darwin is Nightcliff Foreshore. I don't believe it's been officially made as a sacred site, sacred area, but it is still part of my traditional country, my traditional area. So it's sacred in nature to me. It's hard not being there for a very long time. Lots of people tend to go back to their traditional country to, kind of rejuvenate who they are and their spirituality and their identity. But I do like to go to a place like Ngunnawal, which is obviously just in Belconnen. It is actually man-made, so there's no real technical sacredness to it. Like, I don't even know what may have been there before, but it is a body of water, and I do think it is a very lovely place, and I do feel drawn to it. And sometimes I do feel that connection, but nowhere near as intense as I do in Darwin.
So there can be a difference between enjoying a place that you find particularly beautiful and then feeling that connection to a sacred site.
Yeah, I do think there's definitely a difference. Like, comparing it, Nightcliff and Lake Ginninderra, when I'm visiting Nightcliff, I can enjoy the space, but my spiritual and overall connection to that land and that country feels stronger. I feel as if I'm almost a part of the waves or like the cliffs and the sand, I feel intensely connected to it, like tethered to it. Whereas with Lake Ginninderra, no matter how far like down I reach, I don't really feel that kind of connection. It's more about like the actual physical vibe and ambience of the place that makes me just feel a bit calmer and kind of almost on a superficial material level imitates that actual connection that I have in Nightcliff in Darwin. It is still a lovely place though, not denying that, of course.
Can non-First Nations people enjoy sacred sites?
In most ways, yes. It usually does come down to the intention of non-First Nations or non-Indigenous people. It really does come down to them wanting to learn more about the history and the culture of that site, and of course remaining respectful of said history and culture, and possible laws put in place by the traditional owners, of course.
What kind of impact can tourism have on these sacred places?
They tend to have a huge impact, both positive and negative ways. On the positive side, it is very encouraging when more people of non-Indigenous heritage wish and want to learn more about our history. More people are learning that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders history is one of the oldest, possibly if the oldest living and surviving culture in the world. But on the negative side, lots of non-Indigenous and particularly non-Australian people don't fully understand or comprehend the nature of our ways of knowing and ways of life. And there can be a lot of negative connotations of that lack of respect and knowledge. Like with Uluru, that site is incredibly sacred. It's seen as a resting place for our ancient spirits. And for years, people would climb it and dismiss the laws of the traditional custodians. Thankfully, they've now banned it, but it's a little disheartening knowing just how long it took for them to make that decision and make it like an actual law,
Yeah. So many cultures do have sacred sites, whether that be churches or, mosques or other places. But I think it's interesting that, somewhere like the Sistine Chapel is never going to have a gas pipeline built through it or under it or whatever. But because in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture that the sacred places is the land, it's not a physical building necessarily. So do you find that people tend to find it difficult to understand what a sacred place is when in other cultures the sacred place is more of a physical place than it is to the land?
Yeah. You definitely did make it very clear, because I think when it comes to those kind of things, when there's and I think anyone can test it, even, myself and other Indigenous people, when you see a physical building, it's kind of more like obvious, like, oh yes, this is a special place, this is somewhere sacred, it's a bit more like, oh, we can't touch that place. I think when it comes to, especially with not even just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but a lot of First Nations cultures, it is a very spiritual thing. So it could literally be just a flat plane of land, but as long as that specific culture sees a connection to that land, it's automatically sacred. And I think a lot of like what Western society is when it comes to, physical like buildings and things like that, and using the land and owning the land and putting something on it is what they see as is using the land correctly, I guess. And I guess that's why they really can't comprehend that a land can be still sacred even if it doesn't have a church or mosque sitting on top of it, you know what I mean? So hopefully that kind of makes sense, but there definitely is obviously that huge difference between that understanding and a bit of a blockage as well. Yeah.
Oh, that was great. A great explanation.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I also wanted to touch on Indigenous protected areas, which according to the National Indigenous Australians Agency are areas of land and sea country managed by Indigenous groups in accordance with traditional owners' objectives. And there are currently 81 Indigenous protected areas in Australia, which are covering over 36 million hectares of land. But I was wondering, to what extent does the creation of the legal boundaries of sacred sites conflict with the traditional understanding of sacred places as being interwoven and being a part of landscapes and a part of a whole country rather than just one particular, few hectares?
Yeah. Touching on, because obviously with the whole Indigenous people not really understand, putting boundaries in place, I think that's why a lot of the colonizers deemed us as a nomadic race, even though we actually hadn't left the country itself, but we did tend to move around the country itself, and that's why we didn't consider borders or boundaries to be a thing. It's very interesting though, and probably where the lines of Western influence knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing do kind of blur in a way, because we've obviously learnt to adapt and learnt to grow with our society in what ways that we can. And I think because Western society is based off of the concept of ownership and owning and utilising the land you live on, and boundaries play a large part in that, of course. Whereas First Nations ideal is that obviously boundaries aren't something considered, as we consider ourselves a part of the land, always moving and connected with the land. That all being said, with those differences in our current society and how we've had to adapt and what's been going on with colonization and that effect it's had, every day more sites are being heritage listed. We are getting a bit more progressive and noticing that, and those sites are being protected and are given protective boundaries, which in turn we are benefiting from that Western way. Not everything though, of course, but we do benefit from that in order to keep those sacred sites protected. And I think the main issue, and I could be leading off into a different way, is I think the main issue is the land rights. Because while we don't believe in owning the land or putting buildings on top of it and using it for its, soil properties or whatever, it's about being able to protect that land and being able to be one with it and kind of treat it as it should be. I think it's obviously a much larger conversation, but I think that's where the main difference and main issue lies with, Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. But yeah.
Why does preservation matter in terms of culture and the environment?
I guess in terms of preserving culture and in correlation to the environment, I guess just looking at it in just a culture way, like I said before, we are the oldest living and surviving culture in the world. We've faced genocide, disease, dispossession, the stolen generation. We've come through all of that and we're still surviving. We still hold a lot of what our original, what our ancestors were taught and passing those stories on. And it's very important to try and preserve that. Like myself, obviously, for people listening, I am a white passing woman, so it's very important to me, and I would hope important to the children that I will one day have, to make sure I pass that knowledge on, to keep that knowledge preserved and keep that culture, I guess, thriving and living, and so we can still keep that name of being the oldest living culture in the world, and that's why it's very important. It's kind of blurring lines with who's Aboriginal looking or not, because we had the stolen generation, because we were almost bred out. That was the intention. It doesn't necessarily matter how much Indigenous or how much Aboriginality you have. If you know who your people are and know your culture and have an identity to that and a connection to that, there's no reason why you can't identify yourself with that culture.
I want to know if there's a difference between a national park, per se, and a sacred site.
I think there definitely is. For example, like when you look at like botanic gardens or, you know, like little like nature parks that you go to, I don't think those are necessarily sacred sites. When it comes to like not necessarily sacred, but maybe I guess sacred because it's heritage listed. Like for example, Kakadu National Park, that is a national park, but it's actually preserved and taken care of by the traditional owners. And I think more of that is actually happening, where these national parks that we have, they're actually enlisting the help and listening to the voices of the actual traditional custodians. So I believe even one of my own uncles actually works as a ranger in, I'm not sure if it's Kakadu, but they're like a park in the Northern Territory, because he's obviously a Larrakia man, so he's one of the voices that they listen to in helping that. So I definitely think there's a huge difference, and I definitely a different feeling as well. Like when I go to, you know, Darwin's Botanical Gardens, it's a gorgeous place, of course, but it's more for like enjoyment, more for just viewing and things like that. You know, even though that's technically still my land, it's almost like superficial in a way. Thankfully, though, again, because they're finally getting traditional custodians to actually take care of these places. But when I'm on Kakadu National Park, it's more of a connection. You know, it's more. And actually seeing like, you know, Indigenous rangers and tour guides and things like that actually makes it feel a lot more sacred and feel a lot more involved in the culture and a lot more preserving it, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think I understand now.
Hopefully that made sense.
Thank you so much, Casey, for joining us today on our podcast.
Thank you for asking me all the questions. Very lovely questions.
I think we all learned a lot today. So thank you.
Thank you. I like sharing my knowledge. Thank you.